and welcome to today's webinar on Building Support for Affordable Home Ownership and Rental Choices, a summary of research findings on public opinion and messaging on affordable housing. My name is Amy Clark, and I'm Director of Marketing and Communications at the National Housing Conference and Center for Housing Policy. Joining me on this webinar is Janet Viveros, a Research Associate at the Center for Housing Policy. I'd like to thank Capital One for sponsoring NHC's webinar series. Of course, any opinions or errors are ours alone. This research is part of NHC and the Center's work to provide the housing community with resources that will help us build our collective capacity to communicate effectively about affordable housing. NHC and the Center work in concert with NHC's members to help ensure safe, decent, and affordable housing for all Americans. NHC engages in evidence-based advocacy, provides tools for effective communication, and deepens our understanding of housing policy issues through the research of the Center for Housing Policy. A couple of final introductory notes for you. First, let's address technical difficulties. While we hope the webinar runs smoothly for everyone, we all know that this doesn't always happen. If you run into any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box in the GoToWebinar control panel to send a message to the staff so that we can help resolve the issue. If that doesn't work, please email us at chp-feedback@nhc.org. That's chp-feedback@nhc.org. And just so that we can make sure that we're working well from the beginning, could you all just type a note into the question box or the comment box to let us know whether or not you can hear this clearly. Second, please note that all participant lines are muted in order to ensure clear sound quality for everyone. However, we will be taking your questions. If you have a question at any time during the webinar, please submit it through the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll answer as many of your questions as possible at the end of the webinar. And now let's cover another frequent question. Is this being recorded? Yes, it is. An archive copy of this webinar will be available afterwards. We'll send a link out to everyone who registered once the recording is online. Finally, we're excited to introduce a new feature in our webinar series. As you saw in the invitation we sent you, you're invited to continue the discussion with us directly after the webinar at the Housing Communications Hub. The Hub is a free online platform for those who want to communicate more effectively about affordable housing to learn and share communication strategies at work. Many of you have already registered to use the Hub, which is great. Towards the end of the webinar, we'll give you a quick tour of the Hub so that we can continue this discussion online. And now I'm going to turn it over to Janet to begin the conversation.
Thank you, Amy. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the findings from our recent report on affordable housing communications research. Most of the research that we found on this topic is comprised of surveys that focus on two main areas. The first is public opinion about affordable housing, and the second is the effectiveness of different kinds of language and messaging on affordable housing. So today I'm going to highlight some of the most interesting findings and some of the areas of consensus in the research. In terms of the public opinion findings, most of the research shows that housing cost issues have the most traction and the highest levels of concern in areas where housing costs are very high. Housing cost concerns, even when they're high in different areas, often don't translate into action. Many people who are worried about affordable housing don't actually support specific initiatives and programs. Also, affordable homeownership solutions are generally more attractive and gain more support than affordable rental solutions. And particularly since the start of the housing crisis, research shows that more people have a personal familiarity with housing cost challenges. In terms of effective language and messaging, several recommendations emerged from what we found in the research. The first is that it's important to focus on specific beneficiaries and clearly explain to the public who needs affordable housing so that they can understand whether there is actually an affordable housing issue in their community. It's also important to describe these affordable housing programs in ways that explain that participants actually need and deserve help. It also can help to build support when you describe all the benefits the community receives from having affordable housing programs initiatives. And finally, it's important to appeal to commonly held values such as choice, hard work, balance, fairness, and opportunity. So let's dive a little bit deeper into some of these findings. As I mentioned before, in terms of public opinion, one of the first points of consensus that we found in the research is not surprising, but even though there are high levels of concern about housing affordability, more people are even more concerned in places where housing is already expensive. It's easier for people to see that there are affordability problems. One study that really highlights this well was completed before the start of the housing crisis and found that nationally about 14% of the respondents identified housing affordability as their greatest concern ahead of other major issues that households face. But when the researchers broke out the results by different kinds of housing market, they found that the share of people who worried most about housing more than any other issues was significantly higher, 28%, in these higher cost housing markets. And the respondents in the lower cost housing markets were less concerned by housing than by other issues. One of the things that we were curious about as we worked on this study was to see how the housing crisis had impacted attitudes about housing affordability. It's still not clear. There's limited numbers of studies that have been completed since the start of the housing crisis. But we did see a couple of interesting things. For example, as discussion in the public has been dominated by the falling home prices and relative affordability of home buying, we found in an annual national survey on attitudes towards homeownership that worries about housing affordability peaked as housing price peaked in 2005. And then as housing price fell, so did worries about housing affordability. However, when you start to look at the local level and the state level at surveys that have been completed recently, you find that there's still high levels of worry about housing affordability. For example, in Rhode Island, even though home prices fell in that state, a significant share, 82% of the people surveyed believed that the state still had an affordable housing problem. So there's a few things that we can do to leverage that understanding of the crisis of affordable housing and the affordable housing challenges that our communities face. First of all, we can use social math to help folks really understand in kind of a more visceral way what it means to have a housing shortage. So you see this image here is of FedEx Field, which is the football stadium for the Washington area professional football franchise. FedEx Field holds about 92,000 people, and there are around 610,000 homeless people in the United States. I don't really have a good sense of what 610,000 people feels like or looks like. That's an abstract number for me, but if you tell me that there are enough homeless people in the United States to fill FedEx Field or to fill any football field around 6 or 7 times, I understand what that means. I have an understanding of what it's like to be in a big stadium and what that feels like, and that gives me sort of a feeling of how many people are homeless. That's the kind of social math that you can use to get the point across and help make the affordable housing challenge real to people who already kind of understand instinctually that that's happening. Another thing that we can do is focus more on the sort of shortage of affordable housing than we focus on the cost burden. Cost burden is a really important number, and it's an important way to communicate just how great the impact of the housing, of a lack of affordable housing is on an individual family. So it's an important number to use, but if we're going to show people the magnitude of the problem of affordable housing, talking about the shortage really gets us there, simply because I think a lot of folks don't understand the way housing programs work, the fact that, for example, public housing and housing vouchers only serve a quarter of the people who qualify for them. Those are things that aren't clearly understood. So when we make
make clear to people that the shortage is really a challenge, it's easier to understand the problem that we're facing.
Another common finding in the research on affordable housing communications is that housing cost concerns often don't translate into action or support for particular affordable housing initiatives and programs. And the research really doesn't delve into why this disconnect exists. However, in thinking about it, there are several possible reasons why people who worry about affordable housing don't actually do something about it. The first is that they might not understand what it is they can actually do. It's not clear to them how they can impact the issue in their community. Also, it might be that among all the worries that people have, particularly as we're still in this ongoing economic recovery, housing affordability might just not make it to the top of the list, that there are other things that deserve their attention more. Also, many people might generally support affordable housing, but they might be uncomfortable about the possibility of it being located in their community. The one study that we did find that tackled this a little bit was a study that actually comprised of interviews of policymakers. And the researchers found that among the policymakers they interviewed, they identified this sense of little reward and substantial risk in politics in terms of taking action on housing affordability.
So how do we deal with the fact that there isn't the widespread support we need for affordable housing policy and for changing the way we do things, even though people tend to get that there is a problem? I think one of the things that we do as developers and as advocates is focus on the problem a lot more than we focus on solutions. And I think we've all had an experience where someone has told us how terrible something is, and our reaction to that is to say, well, I guess that's it. I guess there's no fixing it. And by focusing on the difficulty that people have in finding affordable housing and the tremendous number of people who need it, we tend to, even though everything that we're saying is true and should be acted on, we tend to give people the idea that this is something that is not even worth trying to fix because it's such a huge problem that can't be solved. So instead, we need to give some people something to aspire to. We need to create a vision of what our communities can be like if that affordable housing is available and if everyone in our community can live and work and play together. Presumably, there are things that all of your communities are doing to make sure that affordable housing is available, from changes to regulations, to funding for affordable housing, to public-private partnerships with businesses in your community. Talk about those things that are happening. Show people that there are actually solutions out there that are in play, that are working, and that this is a problem, as deep as it is, that can be solved. Another thing that we can do is to provide cover to those elected leaders who are the ones who are eventually going to have to make the big decisions and put their necks out there. We have to build coalitions and build groups of people who support these actions so that when we're asking an elected leader to take a risk, they know that there are folks who will support them and speak up for them in the community when there's opposition. And affordable rental solutions. Many people can relate to homeownership initiatives like down payment assistance better than they can relate to affordable housing programs. However, there is the possibility that providing context to people on housing policy, as was done in a recent national survey that offered respondents information on the imbalance in national housing policy that favors homeownership and the growing population for renting, that with that context, people will better understand not only housing needs, but develop more support for rental solutions in addition to homeownership solutions. Another thing that we saw in the more recent studies completed since the start of the housing crisis is that there are more people who are personally struggling to afford their housing. That's unsurprising, but the scale is still
pretty significant when you stop and think about it. For example, in a 2009 survey, over a quarter of the respondents in Massachusetts worried that as homeowners they might not be able to make their mortgage payments. And as recently as 2012 in Long Island, a survey found that over half of the people they interviewed had some trouble paying their rent or their mortgage. Now, at the same time, you have people acknowledging their struggles to pay for their housing. You also have some pretty widespread resentment among the public towards government assistance to homeowners who struggled during the housing crisis. What we aren't really clear on at this point due to the limited number of research and surveys completed is how the crisis has impacted public opinion toward affordable housing. So even though more widespread number and spread of people have struggled with housing and have a better understanding of the gap between the need and affordable housing available, the research suggests that this might not necessarily translate into greater support for affordable housing. So that's something really important to keep in mind as we move forward.
One of the ways that we can try to translate this support, this understanding into support for affordable housing policy and programs is to remind people that we're all in this together. So when I was in college, I had the opportunity to study abroad in Tokyo for a semester, and one of the things that really struck me, and I think strikes a lot of people when they're in Japan, is that the subway stations and other public places in Tokyo are full of what are called manner posters, and they are sort of enforcing community norms and asking people to pick up the trash and be considerate of one another. And the language that's used in all of them is let's do this, let's be part of this. And I think we can take something from that in that affordable housing is something that benefits all of us. It benefits an entire community, even if we're not personally living in an affordable unit. So let's use that inclusive language and talk about it that way. The point is that this is a systemic challenge that we're facing, and when you use that less language, that inclusive language, it'll help us think systemically about the problem and come up with those systemic solutions or understand the value of systemic solutions. We can also use personal stories to show how people who need affordable housing, even if they happen to need rental housing, which, as Janet explained, isn't as popular a solution as homeownership, to show how those folks have the same aspirations as people who can afford market rate housing, and we're really all the same and all in this together.
Now, let's focus a little bit more on the other main component of our report, which focuses on the research about the effectiveness of different language and messaging approaches on affordable housing. So the first thing that we identified in the research is that the surveys found that when you clearly describe who will be eligible or targeted by an affordable housing program, you help people to better understand that there is a need for affordable housing in their community and develop some more support. So, for example, using qualifiers describing income levels like households earning between $25,000 and $45,000 a year, or young families just starting out, helps people to better understand who really needs the assistance.
Building on that idea, we can create local and regional narratives about the affordable housing need that is faced in our community. So be explicit about the wages that are being earned by people in our communities. We can use, there's a lot of data out there about the wages that people earn in our communities and the housing that people can afford with those wages. Paycheck to Paycheck from the Center for Housing Policy is one of those resources, but there are others. And by being explicit about what people earn and what that translates to in terms of housing costs is really helpful in making it clear what the depth of the challenge is in our communities. I'm from the Seattle area, and Seattle, like a lot of communities in the United States, is somewhere where, it used to be sort of a blue-collar city. There were a lot of people who worked in manufacturing. It was a place where, with not a tremendous amount of education, you could earn a good middle-class wage, afford to house your family, and to buy a home. But that's not the case as much anymore. It's become a different kind of economy, and home prices have increased dramatically. And a lot of people have a story about how, they bought their house for $20,000 in 1972, and now it's worth $2 million. That kind of story exists in, communities across the U.S. At different magnitudes and different extents. But there's a story like that that many of us can tell. Tell that story is something that people identify with in the place where you live. And then paint a picture of what your community could look like if the people who work there could afford to live there. When we make that clear, I think we're better able to bring people into the policy and the vision that we have for our communities.
Another point of consensus in the research on language and messaging is really focusing on helping people to understand that beneficiaries of affordable housing programs deserve to be helped and need to be helped. So, for example, using phrases like working families can help to overcome some of the negative connotations that people have in their minds about assistance in general. One thing to keep in mind, however, is that according to the research we found, there's no magic phrase, as you probably all know. It's really about finding the language that best address the local conditions in your community. Different housing markets result in different housing needs. Different community characteristics mean the different communities will respond to different phrasing. So it's really important to understand what kind of language will resonate in your particular community.
As Janet said, there's no magic bullet, but there are a few things that we can use that will help us connect with people who we're trying to convince. Values are a huge way of explaining what we want to see for our communities, and in talking about the need for affordable housing and the solutions that we present. One thing I want you to look at is the opportunity frame. It's something put together by the Opportunity Agenda. There's a link to it here, just toolkit.opportunityagenda.org. They've done some tremendous work on putting together messaging that I think works for a variety of social issues, but we can use it for affordable housing. And it really talks about how equality and community and human dignity are the basis of opportunity. And opportunity is one of those values that all of us really can latch onto. We all want that for ourselves, for our children, for our friends and family and the people around us. And by talking about affordable housing through that opportunity frame and through values frames, we're able to connect with people much better than we would if we were just talking about the magnitude of the problem or just giving a list of numbers and hoping that people will be as convinced as we are.
Another suggestion that comes from the survey results is that it's really important to explain to the public that the whole community benefits from providing affordable housing. It's easy for people to understand how receiving assistance with affordable housing would help an individual household, but people often don't think about how they would also benefit. A lot of people think about what they assume would be the negative outcomes, like traffic congestion, decreased school quality, decreased property values. all of which the research shows does not happen. So it's really important to educate the public that affordable housing does not lead to these negative outcomes, but also to focus on the positive outcomes. For example, many people value living in diverse and inclusive communities. Affordable housing is a really key component to facilitate this. Also, affordable housing has been shown to support other positive social outcomes in areas like health and education. People also value having young families and older adults be able to remain in their community and not get priced out if housing costs increase. And also, as Amy touched on earlier, another key thing and our final recommendation to come out of the research is to appeal to core values such as choice, hard work, balance, fairness, and as Amy mentioned, opportunity. So many people believe that everyone should have the opportunity to live in a home in a safe neighborhood. People also believe that it's only fair that everyone should be able to own a home at some point in their life. So really focusing on these commonly held values to help frame the issue. However, for some people, you're not going to really resonate with that approach. So another approach you can take instead of focusing on the social side of housing is to really take a market approach to the housing market and to talk about how consumers of all kinds benefit from having an adequate supply and variety of housing. So overall, our report and this presentation is just a starting point. More research is needed to better understand how the housing crisis has affected public opinion about affordable housing and to help us understand which kinds of messages and language are effective in different kinds of communities. But this is a good point to start the discussion. So my final point is something of a coda. The reality of the housing solutions that most of us are looking to support and move forward, be they at the federal or state or local level, is that they involve government. And as I'm sure all of you are well aware and recognize in a very deep way, the sort of collective narratives that have developed and become prominent around government are pretty negative, and they make it hard for us to communicate about the value of anything that has government involvement or is funded by the government, no matter which government we're talking about. An organization called Public Works, which is associated with the DEMOS, which many of you may be familiar with, came up with this frame for government of public structure. And they did some really fascinating research and interviews that showed that this was a way for people of all political stripes and all ideologies and perspectives to understand and speak positively about the role of government in our lives. So public structure is a term that I think we can start using and we should keep using when we talk about what housing does for our communities. So just like the public school system is the structure that ensures that everyone in our community gets the education they need to succeed in life, the Housing Trust Fund program in your county is the public structure that ensures that families and individuals in need are able to access the housing that they can afford. I strongly urge you to go to publicworks.org and take a look at their work and take a look at how they use this public structures idea. So that's it for our presentation. We will take questions in a moment. So please do type your questions into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. Before we get into those questions, though, I wanted to make sure to show you a little bit about the Housing Communications Hub. We mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that we'll be jumping right onto the hub after the webinar concludes at 3 o'clock
Eastern to continue the discussion, and we hope that you will join us there. So I'll go there now and show you how to use it. So if you go to hub.nhc.org, you will get to the Housing Communications Hub, and you'll see this red box up here that says log in to see members only content. So please do that. If you haven't registered for the Hub yet, you can click the Create Account button, and it'll take you through the process. You will get an email right away that says that it'll take up to 3 days for your account to be approved. Don't worry, if you do this right now or within the next hour, I will make sure to approve you right away. If you already have an account, and I know many of you do, you can just log in here. I'll do that myself. So once you've logged in, you get a little bit of a different page with your profile up here at the top, so you can see if you've got messages from people. The place you'll want to go after the webinar is to the discussion section. So this is a great place for you to not just talk with Janet and me about the research and about the presentation we gave today, but to talk with one another about the experiences that you've had communicating with a variety of audiences about affordable housing. So what I'm going to do is post a question. And I'm going to post it to the discussion, not the site support. And what I want to know is, even though the literature review that Janet did covers a huge variety of different public opinion and messaging research that's happened over the past decade or so, we know there's more out there. And we would love to hear from you about what your organization has done and what you've seen conducted in your community or elsewhere that can help continue to inform our understanding of best practices in communications about housing. So I'm going to post that right now. So once I put in a subject line and typed in a little bit here to explain what my question is, I will just press send. And it'll submit the message. So I'll edit that so it actually has a question in it so you all can actually respond to it. But let us know what you've seen. And again, once this webinar is over, please hop on over to the Hub and continue the discussion. With this kind of work, we learn as much from you as we do from our own research. So we hope to continue to talk with you. So with that, we will look to see if there are any questions. All right. So there's a number of questions. Yes, the most popular question. Yes, we are archiving the webinar recording, and we will make the slides available. Everyone who registered for the webinar will get an email afterwards with a link to where you can download all of that. Okay. Janet, do you want to take over?
Thanks, Amy. So one question that came in that I saw was, do you have a sense of whether dark or sad imagery is effective? Do you think that would lead people to a defeatist mental frame rather than showing the need? You know, that's a really great question. The research on this area wasn't very extensive, though one particular study did suggest that one option that might be effective going forward is to really use the foreclosure crisis as a way to draw attention to housing affordability and to explain the consequences of not having sufficient affordable housing. It creates these situations where housing costs get out of control and a large number of people fall into a situation where they're unable to afford their housing. And people clearly now understand the widespread negative impacts that foreclosures have on their community, and really helps them to better understand why it's important to avoid getting into these extremely high-cost housing bubbles. Amy? All right, so another question we received is if we have examples of places or communities that have effectively used storytelling and narrative in the way that we're describing. I can think of a couple of examples off the top of my head. The Washington Low-Income Housing Alliance in Seattle has a storytelling project where they've engaged, I think, low-income people or people who are living in affordable housing to tell their stories as a part of their legislative advocacy campaign. So that's the Washington Low-Income Housing Alliance. And another organization that I think is doing some of this work, although there are many others, is in Oregon called Neighborhood Partnerships. And they're really, I think, on the forefront of using a lot of the framing and messaging ideas that we've seen be really successful. But I would urge anyone who is using storytelling and narrative in this way to share that with us on the Hub so that we can see examples of what's been working. I did see one question come up about where to find information and research on housing and affordable housing's connection to other social outcomes in health and education. And there's actually a lot of great resources. But I think the best place to start with is actually the MacArthur Foundation's website. They have a whole section on how housing matters, where they really highlight research that draws those connections between how housing impacts health outcomes, how housing impacts education, and helps people to understand why housing is a critical support of these areas. Another question that came in that I saw was, of course I've now lost it, but one question talked about policymakers and how do you convince them when they're unsupportive of affordable housing, how do you convince them that it's important, and also asking what they found risky. The study that we looked at didn't go into too much detail to really flesh out the responses about minimal reward and significant risk. But I think one of the things you can do to develop some support among policymakers who aren't supportive is to really move beyond just housing and to focus on the other areas that housing impacts. So, for example, when you think about community benefits, some of the research that we didn't put into the presentation that we do have in the report highlights that a lot of people understand there's a really important connection between housing and the economy, that a healthy housing market with adequate amounts of affordable housing supports job opportunities in their community. It draws in business investment. So if you don't have a lot of support among politicians for housing, you can draw their attention to what they do care about. If they care about jobs, businesses care about whether there's enough affordable housing for their workers. So you can really draw the connections there about how housing is just a critical piece to achieving their other goals. To sort of build on the answer to the question about what folks find, what elected officials find risky about supporting affordable housing, what I have seen at the local level is situations where a particular development perhaps has been proposed and there's an idea or a perception of what the people who would live in that development are like. And so it's something that's tough for advocates to tackle, that not in my backyard NIMBY idea, which I think is something that that we should continue to pursue, and I would love to
hear from all of you on the Hub about what you've done to tackle NIMBY-type opposition. But I think a lot of the risk comes from biases against the people who are being served by affordable housing. We have another question that asks, what kind of gap is there between research available and the story that will appeal to people which is fed by that research? Well, based on looking at the research, there are real gaps in the research. Most of the research we found is based on surveys, and so there's some inherent limits in surveys. You have a predefined set of responses, and so you miss a lot of the nuance. And also because there's an effort to make these surveys rigorous and really supportive of serious research, they're often fairly large sample sizes in a region, in a state, some of them are national, and so you miss a lot of the nuance at the local level. And you can feel that in many places by having focus groups. They don't have that same level of rigor, but they can be even more informative on the local level. So if you carry out a focus group in your community, it really helps you to identify what the concerns are, what the misconceptions are, but also what themes and ideas will resonate with people in your community. And you can use all that information to tell that story to really help people to understand the need and what can be done and how they can help. Thank you all for your great questions. I think we're both having a hard time choosing them, and they're really thoughtful and insightful. One question we have is, do you get a sense that we should describe stories of people down on their luck or people who are, quote unquote, just like you and me? You know, I'm going to answer this by not answering it. I think, and we didn't get into this so much in the presentation, but I think one of the things that's really hard is that, you know, particularly when we're speaking with members of the media, folks want to hear a story about an individual, and that kind of story is really compelling. But it also gets you into trouble because, as I'm sure you've seen if you've ever looked at the comments on a newspaper article online about anyone who's in any kind of trouble, it's very easy for people to look at that personal story and say, well, if you hadn't made all those bad decisions, then you wouldn't be in this trouble, and I certainly wouldn't have made the bad decisions that you did. And you know, I think it's a defense mechanism. So I think we need to be conscious of pulling away from that individual story. You know, obviously, people are part of the story. They're the center of the story. But surrounding them is a whole landscape of organizations and funding and policy that makes it possible for them to have a home that's going to help them live the life that they want to live. So when you're telling that story, make sure that you're contextualizing that individual, whether they're down on their luck or whether they're now doing well, contextualizing them within all the greater support that that we've created around them through public structures and through nonprofits and other means. Someone asked me to repeat the name of the organization sponsoring research that links housing to other outcomes. And the organization I mentioned was MacArthur Foundation, and their work on how housing matters. And it's a great starting point to find a great deal of research that connects housing to health and education and other important outcomes. There was another question that came in that asked us to address issues related to the cost of building affordable housing, which is a really great question. It's certainly a challenge to justify spending, particularly in communities that are struggling with the economy. But I think it's important to frame it as investment in the community.
So by investing in affordable housing, in the long term, you can achieve some real savings by having improved health outcomes, having improved education outcomes, and eliminating and reducing the number of interventions that families and individuals will need if they don't have adequate housing. Interventions for homeless individuals and families are far more expensive than actually finding adequate housing for these individuals. So the challenge is explaining how an upfront investment in creating affordable housing saves the community in the long run, but also generates a lot of other positive outcomes that fall outside of the housing context. Okay, so we have another question that came in that asked if we could discuss the research results in the context of racial justice. When I looked at the research, as I said, most of them were surveys, and there was a real effort in surveys to create representative samples of people of all different ethnic and racial backgrounds. So I didn't find any research that specifically addressed race. It's a really interesting thing to think about whether discussing affordable housing in the context of racial justice will resonate with people and develop support in certain communities. It could likely be divisive and not generate support. But when you think about your community and what's important, for example, when we spoke at the Leckie Forum in a county in Northern Virginia called Arlington, it's a community that strongly values diversity and inclusiveness, but it's a very high-cost community. And so that's a community where it could be quite effective to talk about the connection between affordable housing and racial justice, how a lack of affordable housing means that they will not have a diverse community, that it will be more homogenous, and talking about how housing will help them achieve a more representative community that is more rich in culture and background. All right, looks like the questions have slowed down. If you do have more questions, please do let us know using the chat box. Again, the organization Janet was talking about that links housing with other issues like health and education, that's the MacArthur Foundation and their How Housing Matters research. The football stadium analogy. So I was talking at the beginning of the webinar about the concept of social math. It's a way of taking numbers that we don't really encounter often, or we don't sort of grasp onto particularly easily because they're so big, or they're just difficult to conceive of, and social math sort of contextualizes them in a way that we can understand. So the football stadium analogy was that particular football stadium holds about 92,000 people, and there are around 610,000 folks in the U.S. who are homeless. So that's enough to fill 6 or 7 of those football stadiums. That was the idea. All right. We have another question about whether we have ideas about opinions or messaging on rent assistance programs like vouchers rather than building affordable rental housing. That's an interesting question. I think a lot of what we can talk about is essentially having sort of a variety of programs or solutions to the variety of need that's out there, and both of those approaches have positive
investing in affordable housing development means that you're bringing an asset to the community that'll be there to last. And something like vouchers gives people mobility. And I think our message as an organization is really that choice and a variety of different solutions is something that's really important. And having that variety and that choice is how we get to solving the affordable housing challenges in our communities. Does it look like there are any more questions? Okay. So another question. One problem I've encountered is that people who understand the importance of affordable housing but don't understand the resource constraints, because part of the massive voices in opposition to the local housing policy. Does the public opinion or messaging research shed any light on how to address this sort of challenge? Janet, do you have any thoughts about that? People understand that it's important, but end up opposing it because of the resource constraints.
The research didn't speak specifically to this, but I think it comes back to trying to help people understand the different kinds of ways that you can offer affordable housing in the community that Amy touched on. So obviously, building affordable housing is a huge upfront cost, but it's not the only option for creating affordable housing in the community. There's other options that can even fall outside of the government context. For example, there are lots of programs that employers offer to help employees develop down payments. It's a benefit to a company that their employees can find a good place to live that they can afford near their work, and it's a benefit to the employees that they can live in a community near their work that they value. There's different ways that you can approach the issue. So I think a big part of it is educating people in the community about the options. A lot of people don't have a lot of time to do the research, and so it's about finding a way to get through to them and connect to them that there's not just one approach, and certainly resources are constrained, but there's different ways to do it in lower cost ways. And Janet, in the research, did you find anything that was really about specifically how to talk about rental assistance? There wasn't as much that really focused on how to talk about rental assistance. There was certainly a widespread focus on that people are more comfortable with home ownership solutions because a lot of people aspire to become homeowners, and they can understand and relate to helping facilitate that for a lot of households. However, there is one study that I did mention in the presentation that found that when people were given some context to affordable housing policy at the national level, and that there are two components. There's a homeownership approach and there's a rental approach, and given some understanding about the limited options in some communities for affordable renter options, it actually led to improved responses from the people in the survey about their interest in supporting rental options. So I think a lot of it comes back to helping people to understand that there is a need to help renters as well as homeowners. Not everyone is ready or interested in becoming a homeowner, and so in the meantime, they still need somewhere to live that's affordable. And so it's a key part of building a healthy and thriving community is to provide those different options to everyone. It's really heartening to hear that that was the outcome. I think that one of the things that we end up tripping ourselves up on is the sort of uglier frames that have grown
over many years around the housing programs that we champion. I've definitely seen some research where immediately, even without being prompted, people will talk about Section 8 and how Section 8 is bad, and they've encountered that in their community, and for whatever reason they've developed that feeling. And so we have to make sure not to sort of trip ourselves up and take control of a conversation and make sure that we're defining things like rental assistance in the way that we want people to understand them. Don't let sort of an common vocabulary trip us up in these conversations and sort of cause us to lose control of the conversation because we've allowed those negative frames to take over. So just one caution there on that. Oh, yes. Thank you for sharing that. The MacArthur Foundation, which we mentioned before, as part of their How Housing Matters work, released a really fantastic survey on American attitudes towards housing, sort of post-housing crisis. It's on the MacArthur Foundation website in their How Housing Matters section. So please take a look at that. And that would be something that would be great for someone to share on the Hub if you're interested in doing that. All right, well, it looks like we've gotten to just about the end of the questions. Again, we are hopping on the Housing Communications Hub at hub.nhc.org immediately following the webinar, and we hope that you will join us there. I want to thank all of you today for joining us and participating in this discussion. It's been really fantastic, and we really value the interest that you all have in this kind of work, and we hope to continue to do more of it. Again, join Janet and me on the Hub. You can contact us via phone, email, possibly Twitter. And we hope to be in touch with you on the Hub. In the meantime, to learn more about events happening at NHC and the Center for Housing Policy, you can visit us online at nhc.org. And that'll also show you how to connect with us on social media. Thanks again for joining us.